You're here because you want to get informed and get informed fast.
Hmm.
Today, we're plunging into a really fascinating and, well, ongoing battleground in the gaming world.
Yeah, it really is.
The legal fight over video game emulation. And Nintendo, they're often right there, center stage.
Always seem to be, don't they?
We've been looking at discussions around this, and our goal today is to really understand, when playing those classic games outside their original consoles actually bumps up against the law.
Especially with Nintendo involved.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Especially then. And ever catch yourself wondering if, like, firing up an old favorite on your phone is totally okay, legally speaking?
it's a common thought.
Okay, let's unpack this.
What's fascinating right from the start is the core idea of emulation itself.
Right.
It's essentially just software mimicking the hardware of older gaming systems.
Like a virtual console.
Pretty much. Think of it as a digital bridge, really.
Yeah.
It lets these vintage games, these pieces of gaming history operate on your modern devices.
Your phone, your PC.
Exactly. It's like having access to this huge library of classic games right there.
Yeah, these emulators act like virtual retro consoles, letting you dive back into those pixelated adventures on your tablet or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But this is where the legal landscape gets, well, tricky.
Yeah, it does.
Surprisingly, maybe the emulators themselves aren't automatically illegal.
That's a key point.
We've even seen reports that Nintendo's own legal counsel, Koji Nishira, has sort of acknowledged this point.
Right. So it's not the idea of emulation per se.
So what's behind all the legal action then? Here's where it gets really interesting.
Well, the legal complexities, they don't usually stem from the emulator software itself, but more its use.
How people use it.
Exactly. The legal line tends to be crossed when these emulators enable things like, say, bypassing security measures that protect copyrighted games.
Breaking the lock, basically.
Kind of, yeah. Or making unauthorized copies of game code. Or, and this is a big one, granting access to illegally distributed games. ROMs. That's typically when companies like Nintendo step in with legal challenges.
Right. And they definitely have a strategy for protecting their intellectual property. A whole playbook, it seems. Let's look at some of the key moves in that playbook. One crucial area is the circumvention of security.
Right.
Apparently, if an emulator is designed to crack a console's encryption, that digital lock safeguarding their games,
Yeah.
it can violate laws like Japan's Unfair Competition Prevention Act. What's the underlying principle there?
Essentially, these consoles often use cryptographic keys, think of them like digital keys, to check that the game software being played is legit.
Okay.
Emulators designed to bypass this check. They're seen as breaking that chain of trust, allowing unauthorized software, like pirated games, to run.
So it's about protecting the integrity of their whole system.
Exactly. Protecting their software distribution. Then there's the matter of copying code.
Ah, yeah.
Think about the software that makes up the console's own operating system, like the home menu on a Switch.
Right, the interface.
Nintendo considers replicating that a copyright infringement, just like making unauthorized copies of any other creative work.
Like a movie or music?
Precisely. There was an analogy used in some of the materials, likening it to illegally photocopying Mario's overalls.
Huh. Okay, that makes sense. A clear violation of their IP.
Definitely.
And then there's the really big one you mentioned, piracy.
Mm-hmm. The ROM connection.
If an emulator becomes, a tool for playing illegally obtained games, those ROM files you find online,
That's the red flag.
that's a major trigger for legal action. We saw this with the Yuzu emulator, right? Which reportedly had a very substantial Patreon income.
Yeah, something like $30,000 a month, reportedly, before the lawsuit hit.
Wow. So it seems the connection between the emulator and easy access to pirated games is like a central point in Nintendo's legal strategy.
It appears to be, yes.
Was this always the case? Have they always been this active?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, Nintendo has a history of aggressively protecting its intellectual property. It's not new. Going back to, say, 2009, they mounted this significant campaign against DSR4 cards.
Oh, yeah, I remember those, the little cartridges for the DS.
Exactly. Those devices allowed users to play unauthorized games on the Nintendo DS. They actually collaborated with around 50 other companies in that effort.
50? That's huge.
And they ultimately achieved considerable success in reducing the use of those devices. So it shows a consistent pattern of enforcement over the years.
So this isn't a new approach for them at all. Okay, let's dive into some specific, more recent examples then that really illustrate their current strategy.
Good idea.
The case of Yuzu. the Nintendo Switch emulator, it really stands out.
Definitely made headlines.
Nintendo claimed it facilitated a massive number, like around 1 million illegal downloads of The Legend of Zelda, Tears of the Kingdom.
Yeah, and that was before the game officially launched.
Before launch. What does that tell us about Nintendo's priorities here?
Well, that significant number, 1 million pre-release downloads, it really highlights the potential financial impact Nintendo perceives from these emulators.
On their big game sales.
Exactly, especially for highly anticipated titles like Zelda. The lawsuit against the Yuzu developers resulted in a pretty substantial $2.4 million settlement.
$2.4 million. Ouch.
And the emulator was subsequently shut down as part of that. The size of that settlement, it isn't just about recouping estimated lost sales,
It's a warning shot.
It sends a powerful deterrent message to other emulator developers. It could potentially discourage further development in this whole area.
And then we have Rejinx, another Switch emulator. Interestingly, Nintendo's reaction there seemed different, less aggressive, maybe.
That's right. Instead of immediately filing a lawsuit, like with Yuzu, they reportedly just sent a request to the developers to cease the project. A takedown notice, essentially.
Huh. What might explain that less aggressive approach? Why not sue them too?
Well, it could suggest a more nuanced strategy. Perhaps Nintendo assesses each emulator based on different factors, like its popularity maybe, or the extent to which it's directly linked to piracy, or maybe even the developer's willingness to cooperate. A cease and desist letter might just be a first step before escalating.
So trying the softer approach first sometimes.
Potentially, yeah. Or maybe the circumstances were just different enough in their view.
Okay, so what does all this tell us about their overall goal right now?
Wow.
It leads to an interesting theory, doesn't it? The timing and the intensity of these actions against Switch emulators? Could they be linked to Nintendo's rumored upcoming hardware?
The Switch 2.
Often called the Switch 2, yeah. By aggressively targeting these emulators now, they could be aiming to minimize the risk of widespread piracy on their new platform right from launch day.
It certainly looks like it could be a preemptive measure, clearing the decks, so to speak, to safeguard future game revenue for the next generation.
Makes sense from their business perspective.
But this brings up a really important counterpoint, what's often called the preservation paradox.
Ah, yes. The other side of the coin.
Exactly. On one side, you have Nintendo strongly protecting their current and future revenue streams. Makes business sense. But on the other side, many people argue that emulation plays a crucial role in preserving video game history.
Especially for games that just aren't commercially available anymore.
Right, or games whose original hardware is dying out.
Yeah.
What's fascinating here is this inherent conflict, this tension between protecting commercial interests and the sort of cultural value of preserving older games.
Yeah, it's a real clash. For many gamers and historians even, emulation is seen as the only way sometimes to ensure these classic games aren't lost forever as consoles become rare or break down.
It's a valid argument.
However, Nintendo's stance seems pretty clear. They prefer to handle the re-release of their classic games themselves.
Often through subscription services like Switch Online.
Right. Bring it out on their terms, maybe charge for it again. How does the pricing of these re-releases factor into this whole debate?
Well, that's a key point of contention for some people. There have been discussions, some reports suggesting Nintendo might price these retro re-releases quite high. Maybe, close to a new game price point.
Like $60 for an old NES game?
Potentially, yeah. Or at least bundled in ways that feel expensive. And that raises questions about accessibility and affordability for consumers who just want to revisit these older titles.
Yeah, that could definitely lead to frustration if you feel like older games should be more readily and affordably available, especially if you bought them once already.
Precisely.
We also saw a really concrete example of this tension with Dolphin, didn't we? The emulator for Nintendo GameCube and Wii games.
Ah, yes, the Steam situation.
It was actually set to be released on Steam, the huge PC gaming platform. That would have made it way more accessible to millions of people.
A big step into the mainstream.
But then, after Nintendo apparently intervened legally with Valve, the company that runs Steam,
The release was blocked.
yeah, ultimately blocked. What does that incident really highlight about Nintendo's control?
I think that situation really underscores the extent of Nintendo's desire to control the distribution and the whole experience of their games, even the much older ones.
Even non-commercial projects like Dolphin.
Exactly. Blocking Dolphin on Steam demonstrates their willingness to actively prevent even well-established non-commercial emulation projects from gaining that kind of mainstream access. Likely because, well, it could potentially detract from their own efforts to re-release those games on their terms in their ecosystem.
Control seems key. Okay, so let's address the question many of you listening are probably thinking about right now. Can you legally emulate games at home? Is there a way?
Technically,
Yeah.
based on the legal discussions around this, if you legally own a physical copy of a game, say an old SNES cartridge or a GameCube disc,
You bought it fair and square.
right, and if you were to make a digital copy or dump the ROM from that specific physical copy you own,
To your own personal use.
for your own personal backup and use with an emulator, yes, that could be argued as legally permissible in some jurisdictions. These ROM files are essentially just digital copies of the game's data pulled from the original cartridge or disc.
Okay, so that sounds potentially okay.
Potentially, but
But as straightforward as that sounds, the reality for most people is quite different, isn't it?
it really is.
For instance, it's been mentioned that you might need specific, sometimes obscure hardware, like a particular type of old disk drive or special adapters,
Right, things like a modded console or specific PC peripherals.
to even create those digital copies from some game formats. And that kind of equipment isn't exactly common or easy to use for the average gamer.
Precisely. So while the narrow legal possibility might exist for creating your own ROMs from games you physically own, the practical hurdles, the technical know-how required, it makes it an unrealistic solution for most users.
So downloading ROMs you find online is definitely out.
Generally, yes. That's distributing copyrighted material without permission.
Okay.
Ultimately, the world of emulation exists in what can really only be described as a legal minefield.
That sounds about right.
Navigating it requires a significant degree of caution and an understanding of the potential legal risks involved. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the accessible, clearly legal path to playing retro games through emulation, it remains complex and uncertain for most people.
Right. So to wrap things up then, the key takeaway here seems pretty clear. Nintendo is actively and often aggressively fighting against video game emulation.
Very actively.
Their main concerns center on preventing piracy, obviously, and protecting their business interests, especially, it seems, in relation to their current and future console releases. Protect the bottom line.
Absolutely. And it's crucial to remember, as we discussed, that there are really different valid perspectives on this whole issue.
Yeah, it's not simple.
While Nintendo is focused, understandably, on protecting its intellectual property and its revenue streams, there's that strong counterargument emphasizing the importance of game preservation
Keeping gaming history alive.
and providing access to classic titles, especially those that are just gone commercially. The whole legal situation surrounding emulation really reflects this ongoing and, frankly, complex tension.
It really does. Given Nintendo's firm stance and their history, it really makes you wonder, what will the future of how we access and play older video games ultimately look like? Will all be locked behind official subscriptions? Or will preservation find another way? This raises an important question, maybe one for you to consider long after our deep dive today.